So I started this channel on a complete whim. I wanted to have a place where I could talk about things that I love and things that I've loved in the past. I'm not expecting like a huge following or anyone to really care about my opinions that much. This is just totally for fun. This is the beginning of a series I've wanted to do for a while now, a complete personal retrospective of the X universe in general, and mainly focusing on the original run of the New Mutants. The New Mutants, the original run, is my favorite comic book series, and was really such an integral part of my young and teenage life. I've always really wanted to comb through it again. My plans for this series to go through each issue or property and give it a synopsis, then try to remember my feelings from when I originally read it or consumed it, and finally my thoughts on how the stories, art, movie, characters hold up today. So this is the first episode of what I'm calling Mutant Memories. I will definitely be hitting all the New Mutants material, but I might branch out a little bit into the now vintage X-Men series that either overlap with New Mutants storylines or issues, and just X stories that I enjoyed in general. I might also want to talk about the New Mutants and X-Men movies and television shows, maybe not so much the cartoon because a lot has been said about it, and I don't really think I have a lot to add, but who knows, we'll see in the future. Basically, I want to go on a huge nostalgia trip, and I want to do so publicly on YouTube to work on my public speaking a little bit. I'm trying to get better at it, so I thought this might be a fun project. So I guess here we go. I started reading comics when I was very young, maybe 6 or 7. I was really into Archie and those comics that would appear in Disney Adventures magazine, which ran until 2007. How I started reading X-Men and the New Mutants is a little murky to me, but I'll try and remember it as best I can. There were these 2 boys I knew who were older and very into comic books. One of them was my best friend's older brother, and the other was a family friend. I think being a huge tomboy, I really admired them, and eventually they let me read some of their comics, which were mostly X-Men. I eventually began buying my own comics using chore money and becoming engrossed in the back issues of X-Men. I bought all the old things I could find and began to watch the X-Men animated series as well. Soon I had outread the animated series and became kind of an annoying nerd about vintage X-Men comic book, especially the 70s and 80s. I had not read everything because I had to find everything in back issues, and finding entire storylines could be hard back then, but I knew quite a bit for being so young. I didn't get into more modern X-Men until a year or 2 after I started collecting and reading, because the before-mentioned family friend told me that X-Men really sucked after Jim Lee left, so everything after Jim Lee I didn't really touch that much until a little bit later. I remember finally reading X-Men Series 2, issues 18 and 19, where the X-Men go to Russia to visit Colossus's parents, and of course everything goes sideways and Peter's parents are killed, and he rescues and becomes the sole family of his younger sister Illyana. I had seen an older Illyana in other back issues, so I was confused about how she became a little girl in these later issues. I read most of the X-Men out of order, as I mentioned before, in small chunks, so looking back, I guess I just didn't hit the storylines where it explained Illyana's backstory. I just knew her as Kitty Pryde's friend. Again, my memory is a little hazy at this point, but I think New Mutants started this way. I found this old issue of Wizard magazine that was celebrating the 30th anniversary of the X-Men. There was an article that was an interview with Louise Simonson. Louise Simonson was not only a woman in comics, but she was a comic writer, which was my dream profession at the time. There was also a photo of Illyana as a teenager, too, in the list of back issues in the back of the Wizard. The Simonson interview was really interesting, and I really liked her point of view about comics and characters and story arcs. Simonson talked about her time working on the New Mutants, and I immediately knew I wanted to read it. I also found out Illyana had been a teen mutant and had been called Magic, and first appeared as the teenager Illyana in 1983. 1982 was the first appearance of the New Mutants, and their own book started in 1983. I can't tell you what drew me to Illyana, but I was just intrigued, and I decided I needed to learn more about her, and that meant I needed the limited series about her. After some frantic calls to every comic book store in the area, I finally had to face the reality that no one had it, and I was so sad that I couldn't read it. I really wanted to read it, but by chance, we visited my grandparents that weekend, who lived in a different part of the state, and I called all the comic book stores near them, and one of the shops had the whole series. I remember my father and I going to this amazing store that sadly went out of business a few years later, so I had my Magic series. Needless to say, I loved this series, and I fell in love with Ilyana instantly. I'll probably do at least a few videos about Ilyana, but that will have to wait for another time. Reading the mini-series Magic and Storm changed my life, and I knew I wanted to consume everything Ilyana was in. I was pretty obsessed. I was also interested in the New Mutants because she was in it. I had never felt so kin to a character before, and things about Ilyana really resonated with me, and her story was so interesting and kind of tragic. And that was when Shadowcat was dethroned as my favorite mutant. I could talk for hours about Ilyana, but again, I'll do that at another time. I began to collect mostly New Mutants comics instead of X-Men comics at this point. The first issue I read of the New Mutants was New Mutants number 14, a very Ilyana-centered story, but I also found myself quite charmed by the art and coloring, as well as the other young mutants. Around the same time, I got a copy of Uncanny X-Men 303, which, if you don't know, is the issue where the child Ilyana dies from contracting the legacy virus. I was so heartbroken, and even though it had already happened, I didn't know until I read this issue. All the issues I got surrounding that event were also very upsetting for me, so I kind of stopped getting X-Men comic books made past her death, and then I went super hard on the New Mutants. I began to collect everything I could find of the New Mutants, and I was delighted over the new Ilyana content, but I also found myself so attached to every character in the New Mutants, and to my surprise, I enjoyed it more than X-Men. I think part of this was I was a teenager when I started reading New Mutants, probably almost 12, and I related more to the teenagers in New Mutants than the adults in Marvel's other books. Still to this day, I have such fond memories of reading this series and the fandom surrounding it. I still have all of my original New Mutants comics I bought back then. They are all beat up and loved, but I never got rid of them. I kept a lot of my other comic collection too, but every so often, even now, if I'm close to a comic book store, I do pop in and look for the few issues from the original run of New Mutants I'm missing. I think I have all but 10. This is the story of how I began reading New Mutants and my comic book history before I read it. I originally read this series out of order, but for obvious reasons, when I review it, I'm going to do the series in order. So next time I will start out with the first appearance of the New Mutants, the 1982 graphic novel titled New Mutants by the iconic Chris Claremont. Sorry for the quality of my voice. I'm still getting used to my new microphone, and I do have a lisp, and I perpetually have a sinus infection, so I always sound kind of weird, but I'll work on it. In the next episode of this series, we will get into it. Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed this series, and welcome to Mutant Memories.